House prices are unlikely to collapse in the coming 18 months. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir.
We're back.
We are back. It's good to be back in the studio with you, Martin, after 3 months.
Still socially distancing, but that's fine.
Indeed.
So, big topic today, house prices.
2 points. One is we've had a lot of feedback about our last show about the paradox. Now, we're going to come to the paradox in a future episode, but we need to take the audience on a bit of a route on a number of other topics before we come to the paradox, because the next few shows will explain why the paradox exists, in my view. So we'll get to that. So people have been asking me, when's the paradox? When are you going to tell us what it is? So I've had about 300 emails on that. A number of people know what it is in detail. Some people don't know. But if people still want to guess, feel free to email me through their answer to the paradox. But we'll come to that in the next couple of weeks. But the key subject, Martin, that I've had a lot of feedback on from our audience, and it has been something that I've been focused on over the last couple of months, is where to from here for the global economy. Now, I've just published an article on my website on adamseconomics.com. We'll put it on the screen. And the question I ask is, can central banks save the largest debt bubble in world history? So we've had a number of different viewpoints being expressed on our show over the last couple of years, but also with you and Walk the World. Is it the dent deflationary depression? Is it stagflation? And I know that Tony Lecanto on your Walk the World channel has said stagflation. Is it Japan? Or is it something completely different? Now, 2 years ago, when I wrote for news.com.au, the 6 Pathways to Australia's Economic Armageddon, I presented 6 scenarios. And of those 6, now the Harry Dent scenario of a deflationary depression is my scenario 1. But what I've come to conclude is in the short term, at least, and when I say short term, the next 12 to 18 months, we're likely to head towards stagflation. Now, we're not going to go into a lot about stagflation today, but I think the key message I want to get across to the audience is, because I know people have taken specific financial decisions resulting from the Dent thesis about a severe crash in house prices. And what I would like to communicate to the audience is that on the evidence that I can see so far, I don't see that happening in the next 18 months.
Right, bold claim. But the fact of the matter is, it's very hard to know, isn't it? That's why scenarios are quite useful. But there are some factors to take account as to why it is that perhaps the debt bubble is going to go on for a bit longer, right? And if the debt bubble goes on for longer and doesn't explode, then effectively the downward forces on house prices are less. Indeed.
Now the thing is that so there were some very specific things, because I just wanted the audience to know is, the Dent thesis of a severe price house crash, you've said 40%, and on my debate against Christopher Joy, I said 40 to 80. Now, but I did couch that, and I said something very specific. So I'd like to just replay what I said back in March of last year, just so we can relive exactly what my claim to Australia was.
So the question is, if we've got the biggest debt bubble in the history of the country, where's the debt? The debt is in property. There's debt bubbles right across the world, and in different economies that's situated in different areas. So the debt bubble is in the housing sector. And what I've argued is, so I've written several columns about economic Armageddon. Armageddon comes when the debt represents a systemic crisis to the Australian economy. So there's a number of scenarios I've written about, and some of them revolve around if we default on the debt. So, for example, if households can't pay their debts and the banks get in trouble, this could lead to extremely sharp falls on property from 40 to 80%, depending if the banks survive. If the banks survive. No, there are scenarios, just like in 1892, when the banks did not survive, the level of house price falls is even more extreme than, say, Martin North. But If the Reserve Bank, if APRA, if the government steps in with macro intervention, then the question is, well, they could stabilise house prices, and that potentially could be, the falls could be lower than some of the more extreme forecasts, but that comes at a cost. And the cost is the value of the dollar, given the amount of foreign debt we have, because once our international creditors lose confidence in our ability to meet the foreign debt, the dollar, the dollar will crash. So effectively what I'm saying is Armageddon is either, for Australia, a housing crash or a dollar crash. But we can't get out of this problem because the amount of debt in the economy is unparalleled in Australian history.
Okay.
Right, so that was pretty specific, John, wasn't it?
Indeed. So basically I said that we have this big debt bubble in Australia. We have a global big debt bubble. If that bubble becomes a systemic crisis to the point that it collapses, that's how prices will fall 40 to 80%. But through stimulus, monetary and fiscal stimulus, there is a pathway to stabilise the housing market, but that comes at a cost. And I did say in that clip that if you do try to stabilise the housing market, the prices will fall, but it will be less than 40%. So my view is we will see falls because of COVID-19 and the lockdown. It will not be 40% because of the stimulus, because the RBA, the Morrison government, but also all central banks and governments around the world, including BIS, IMF, etc., are doing everything they can to keep this debt bubble intact. And because of that, there is a consequence to that action, and that is there's going to be an issue with the value of currencies, including the Australian dollar. So this is where the housing crisis, dollar crisis. It seems to me that at least in the next 18 months, we're going to have an issue with inflation. We're going to have an issue with in terms of the currency. And I know you've sort of said about Japan, and in Japan they did print a lot of money, and it didn't lead to runaway inflation like a Zimbabwe or a Venezuela or a Germany 1923. And we'll talk about Japan in a subsequent episode, but I thought today let's just concentrate on this issue of will the debt bubble collapse in the short term? Because I know a number of people have, like I said, they've sold the property, listening to Harry, they've rented, they're renting, they've got a lot of money in a bank, or in multiple banks, thinking that prices will crash quite heavily, and they'll be able to buy property, at a 50% discount. And I think the key thing is that if you are in that circumstance, and you think that this is going to happen very soon, now I'm not saying that it won't happen in the outer years, but I think in the immediate future, it's unlikely that that scenario is going to play out. And if you are in that circumstance that you're looking to buy, you've got to make a decision about, do you continue to rent or do you buy now? And obviously everyone's circumstances are different.
Yeah, so 2 points. Firstly, rents are cheaper than they ever were and they continue to fall. So many people will actually do better by renting at the moment. The second is, of course, Harry's fundamental thesis is the stock market will crash first. And it will be the crash of the stock market that will then lead to the crash in house prices. So it's very important to understand that he doesn't look at house prices in isolation to the broader stock market crash that he fundamentally believes is going to happen.
One of the key points I wrote in my essay was that in order for... So remember, why a house price is so high is because of this household debt bubble. So what we need from an economic point of view to see is the debt has to shrink. So think about global debt. It's according to the Institute for International Finance, it's at $255 trillion as of the end of 2019, 322% of GDP. So the question the audience has to ask is that global debt bubble, is the Australian debt bubble going to shrink? Now, how does it shrink? I mean, people are talking about a jubilee, but a jubilee, there's no calls from the establishment for a jubilee.
Steve Keen wants it though.
Well, Steve Keen wants it, but obviously he's not in the halls of power.
Sure.
So the only way the debt bubble will shrink is through defaults. And who will default? Households, corporates, and governments. Yep. And if you have defaults, that means that banks will go. And if we have a big bank a globally systemically important bank like a HSBC or a Deutsche Bank or a JP Morgan, Royal Bank of Scotland, etc., one of these big ones, if that was to go, that's the sort of necessary condition for this debt to shrink. So they are printing like crazy to stop that event from occurring. Now, when you and I went to Sydney 2 years ago and I sat down with Harry, so we replayed this one of the episodes a couple of months ago from our discussion from November of 2018, and we recorded. We'll put it up on the screen because we replayed it on this channel. And I think it's important that people need to go back and listen to what we said and what I asked Harry, because Harry had a key assumption. He said that there will be a limit to what the central banks can print, and when I heard him say that in 2018. I didn't believe him then, and 2 years on into 2020, the central banks are printing like crazy. Everyone's distracted with COVID-19 and riots and all sorts of other issues, and there is no. Harry said there will be voices to stop the central bank from doing this, and the reality is now that we're in this situation, there are no voices. Jerome Powell has said there are no limits to money printing. If we have to print to infinity, we will print to infinity, and no one has to date bat an eyelid. So the key assumption that Harry has relied on has not come to pass yet, and therefore the collapse that he has said that is going to come, I just don't see it happening in the short term.
It's worth saying that the Fed this week have announced they're actually going to buy bonds, corporate bonds directly. They were buying AFTs previously. They're buying bonds in the primary market and in the secondary market. So more evidence that the Fed is prepared to buy anything and everything to keep the bubble going.
Indeed. And look, so I just want to raise 2 points, Martin. So I just want to bring this graph on the screen. So this is from the balance sheet of the US Federal Reserve. So when we look at so we had quantitative tightening in through 17, 18, 19. And then by August of last year, the balance sheet, because it went from 800 billion to 4.5 trillion, then it came down on the 20th of August last year to about 3.76 trillion. And as of last week, we're up to 7.17 trillion. So within the space of, say, 9-10 months, the balance sheet of the US Federal Reserve has increased at 90%. And they've said that, if they need to go higher, they'll go higher. So will it be 10 trillion? Will it be 20 trillion? We don't know. But the other key point is that, this was reported by Business Insider this week, that US federal debt is now at 26 trillion, and the Congress has no limitations as to how much additional spending they will produce. So I think this is a demonstration of why the debt bubble to date has not collapsed, because of all this injection of fiscal and monetary stimulus.
And 80% of the Fed's increase is since September, when the repo market blew up. Right?
Absolutely.
So it's actually a not very long period. Massive amount of expansion of debt. And now the trajectory they're on is something which I think will continue, because basically Powell has said we're going to be doing this for 4 or 5 years.
Indeed, and obviously it's not just the Americans; it's the Japanese, the Chinese, in terms of the Europeans, in terms of the Bank of England. You name it.
They're all doing it.
Exactly, and so here is the key issue: is going back to this title of my essay. Can the central bank save the biggest debt bubble in world history? Well, they're trying, and so far they're succeeding. How long can they go before the experiment ends? That's what we don't know.
No, it's worth also saying, John, because they're all doing it, the differential movements between currencies are much less than many people expected. So, the Aussie dollar's up at 70 something, or close to 70 now, right? And Westpac's actually come out and said it'll be at 70 by the end of the year and 76 next year.
Yeah.
Because everybody's doing it, so the water's rising, but it's rising equally and everywhere.
Exactly. Now, one immediate question that is coming up, and I know you've talked a lot about this on Walk the World, is September.
Yep.
So September is very important in the Australian context because of this financial cliff. So this is when a number of payments, JobKeeper, JobSeeker, and a range of other incentives flagged to end. At the same time, the banks will start to say to customers, start to repay. So the repayment holidays will end. Now, in theory, if all of that came to pass, you will see a cash flow crisis with a whole host of households. Now, you're in a better position to say that if this was done in the way that they're describing, would there be enough people to collapse the banks and to collapse the property market? I mean, that's what I don't know on that point. But I think the more important point is that I think this issue of the financial cliff is a bit of a furphy, because we've already started to see coalition politicians saying we're going to extend JobKeeper. Yesterday, I was actually on the phone with the coalition MP, and he said that we can't allow this to occur. So this is people on the backbench. They're already sort of, privately and publicly saying we're going to, we've already taken the country in this direction. We can't stop halfway. You can't be half pregnant on this stuff. So there are calls on that. The OECD has already called for the extension of JobKeeper, but also for more stimulus on top of what we've already had, so that they can try to get GDP going again into 2021. And so I think we will see further policy adjustments. I don't think there will be a cash flow crisis. Now, there could be in certain parts of the economy. I think maybe we discussed the other day on the phone, and I think you said Cairns was one area because they rely on tourism. Yep. So there could be some additional support for certain parts of the country. But because this is all linked to the banks, and again, who runs, having worked in Parliament, and now that I see Parliament and how this economy really runs, well, who really holds the power in this country? It's the banks. It's the RBA. Yep. And they're not going to allow themselves to collapse. So, I mean, the government is just going to do whatever it takes to make sure these banks don't go bust. And so that's why I think we'll see more stimulus, and there will be no cash flow issue in September.
And APRA came out today and basically said that banks on the standard capital structures don't need to mark the properties to market as they go now.
Yep.
Because if they did that, they'd have to hold more capital. So they're saying, no, that's fine. You can just keep things where they are. So that's another example of the regulators falling over backwards to protect the banks.
Exactly. So I mean, prudential standards, all of the things that you require about banks being prudent, capital buffers, all of this. I mean, all of these are adjustable settings when the rubber hits the road.
Yeah. Would you like an interest-only loan? Fine, no probs.
Oh, of course, and look, I'm glad you said that, Martin, because that will be another mechanism that the banks will use. So the government will actually do things to help this cash flow crisis, but with customers, whether they're saying to people, you don't have to go back on P&I, or we can extend certain terms. Yeah. Or more holidays, whatever the case may be, there'll be a pathway to manage this. Now, if we do have a second wave, if there is a second lockdown. Now, I should say, if we have a second wave, I don't think we're going to lock down the way we locked down the first time. But if we did, no doubt there'll be more unnatural, what you call unnatural acts going forward to ensure that the system doesn't collapse.
Yeah, they will do everything. And I think you're right. The second wave, if it does come, hope it doesn't, but it will probably be managed in a rather different way. But nevertheless, as the OECD said in their recent scenario analysis, that if a second wave comes, then it kicks the unemployment rate higher for longer. Yep. It creates a huge hole in GDP, and it creates not only a local crisis here, but if it was in other countries too, the international trade aspects of that, like tourism, those things, that would have a huge long-term impact.
Yep.
So second wave is not something we want, but it's a scenario we should be aware of.
Yep. Now, I caught a lot of attention on social media on Sunday because I put out a message which I didn't think too much of, but it actually got a lot of people buzzing. So on Sunday, I got a phone call from a federal MP, and we were having a discussion mainly about 60 Minutes and what was 60 Minutes going to reveal on Sunday night. But then this MP asked me this question, what would it take for the financial markets to collapse within 1 hour? So to be honest, I was sort of taken aback by this sort of question, and we had a bit of a discussion about what this MP was thinking, and where things potentially could go. So the reason why I just want to bring this up now is, so even though I say today that I don't think house prices are going to fall or collapse. Now they could fall, but they're not going to collapse. That could change quite easily. Now, let's put this on the screen. So I think there's 3 key conditions in my mind that if one of these 3 things happens, the debt thesis will come true. So condition 1 is if they withdraw the stimulus, you start to see defaults. Debt will shrink, the debt bubble will shrink, and you will see a deflationary depression. So that's one. Scenario 2 is if you see a shock. Now, we've had the COVID-19 shock, but that hasn't been enough to collapse the system. But there are some people saying there could be a shock that is so big that no matter how much they print, they can't save the system. So think of a tsunami. No matter what you do, you can't stop the force of the tsunami. So what could that be? Now, some people have said that if the global derivatives bubble, which is more than $1 quadrillion, if that was to blow up, the central banks could not print enough money to stop the impact of that explosion. Now, obviously, they're printing to ensure that these derivatives don't blow up, but there is some chatter out there in the global economics community to say that there could be something so powerful like a nuclear explosion in financial terms that they just can't control. Now, if that was to happen and it was subsume the banks and the banks couldn't print $20 trillion to save it, that could be the scenario 2. Or scenario 3 is that, and I was listening to Real Vision the other day, and this was one of the key questions that no one knows the answer to, because as a species, we've never been in this position before, is we're at $255 trillion. How much more can this debt bubble expand before the system just can't take any more debt? Because at some point, theoretically, those holding these debt instruments, which are largely bonds, they're going to realize that these bonds are worthless and they're going to start to dump them. And once you dump these bonds, these interest rates will go up, and those higher rates will lead to increase in interest servicing costs, and that could collapse the debt. So, but when is that point? So could we go to 300 trillion, 400 trillion? At what point will the system say, this is too much debt and we're just not going to accept any more of these debt instruments? No one knows that answer. Some people think we have too much today. Some people think that we can go on for another few years. But this is like the ultimate unknown question within economics, because again, we've never been here before.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, I think there, John, that you've got to look at debt in piles, right? So there's the household sector, which is about what they can service. With interest rates very low, they can service more, but nevertheless, the debt is higher than it's ever been. Corporates, bit the same, but corporates are using debt basically to buy back shares and to artificially inflate their performance and create a ton of zombie companies in the process, right? And governments are printing big, so the government sector is also printing as well. There are different rules, if you like, of engagement in each of those 3 piles of debt, right? So it starts to get very complicated to try and work out how much debt is too much debt and what are the consequences and what would trigger it.
Indeed. So yeah, but I think that if we don't see one of those 3 scenarios from playing, we have some way to go before we start to see real deflation. People talk about deflation, but what is ultimate deflation? It's the debt. The debt has to shrink, and so far we haven't seen that. So the question then becomes, Martin, well, what are the implications? So I think there's a couple of implications. The first one is before COVID-19. We were in all sorts of trouble as a country, and globally we were in huge trouble. Now, there's a lot of Australians out there who think that post-lockdown everything is going to go back to a rosy scenario. The answer is, so speaking to a few people in small business, they said, and I think that even the Prime Minister said that it's going to take 2 years for the economy to recover. But even if economic activity went back to where we were in, say, January or February, we have so much more debt. Interest rates are so much lower. So there's a consequence to what we have. And I would say that our problems have compounded to where we started at the beginning of the year. And obviously, again, there is a consequence to this stimulus, which is going to be inflationary, and we'll talk about that in the next show when we talk about Japan. So that's point number one. Our problems haven't gone away; they're worse. The other implication is that I've lost all confidence that we can get our way out of this situation. I mean, Parliament's incapable of any sort of meaningful reform. And to me, they're just... And I was actually speaking to a few people in Canberra today just to get a sense as to what, even the bureaucracy, what people are saying. And it just seems like Canberra's hell-bent on just kicking this can down the road and just leaving it for another generation to handle. So I think things are going to be sort of delayed in terms of don't let this happen on my watch, and obviously more printing, more stimulus, and I think that's what the country expects politicians to do. To basically, there's this huge attitude about the government will save me, because people don't understand there's a consequence to government saving you, and I think we haven't reached that moment of realization for the population. So I would invite people to read my essay. Now this is like I think a 4,000, 5,000 word essay, so there's a lot to this, and there's other parts of this essay we're going to break down in the next future episodes. But I think that if you are renting, if you are thinking that prices are going to collapse soon and you're going to pick up a cheap property, I would say that the prospects of that happening in the next 6, 12, 18 months is very low. We will have an issue with the dollar, and one of the big things, and I've said it on another channel, but I haven't said it with you, Martin, is with the lockdown, because I knew a bad economic event was going to happen. I mean, I was fully prepared financially, with no debt and plenty of precautions, and I haven't suffered economically. And I think there was a show you did on Walk the World where you said that 74% of Australians are more financially stressed because of the lockdown. So the 26% that were not affected, I'm one of that 26%. But I would say, so, and I had a reasonably sort of balanced approach between inflation, deflation, because I wasn't sure exactly where we're going to go. Because now I think we're headed towards stagflation, I've taken a number of more deliberate steps to get my family ready for that scenario, and it is very different to prepare for a stagflation, inflation type of environment versus deflation, and people need to be very careful about asset allocation, because if you get this wrong, it can cost you a lot of money. So one example could be, if you do hold cash, if you do hold fixed income products, and we do have a lot of inflation, the real value of your capital will be eaten away. So that's one way of, if you think the Harry scenario is going to happen and it doesn't happen, it could hurt you financially. So again, not to give financial advice, but people need to be very cautious of, if they are following a scenario and they're allocating capital according to that scenario, they need to understand what they're doing and the implications if they're right, and the implications if they're wrong. And so I've done that in my situation, and I'm sure you may have done some steps yourself.
Well, I am not as clear-cut as you are as to what those two futures are going to be. I still think there is a risk of the other story playing out. In other words, deflation and things losing value, right? So I've positioned essentially to be flexible on both sides at the moment.
Yeah, and I should say that's where I was in February.
Exactly. So I haven't gone the same route as you, because I am less convinced, compared with you, as to how this is going to play out, right? Because I still think I still worry more about what Japan can tell us, and we'll look at Japan on another occasion. So, But you're right. People need to think carefully, and I guess there are a couple of questions, John. The first question is, what are the leading indicators that would tell you it's more likely to be inflationary or deflationary, right? Because there will be some different leading indicators in those two scenarios, right? Second question is, how long is this going to play out over? Right? Is it going to be, a few weeks, or is it going to be over 2 or 3 years? Because that will actually also change. And then the third is, sure, house prices might not go 40% down, but they're still going to go down, even in an inflationary world, right? So it's about relativities as well, and that's the other thing people need to get their heads around as well.
Yes, and you know, we'll answer some of those questions in a future episode. But the key point, just on that last point, is what I'm saying in this show is house prices are unlikely to collapse.
Yes,
I'm not saying they are unlikely to fall.
Yep, very important difference.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So 10-20%. Now, in certain segments of the market, high-rise capital city apartments could be even, you could see 30-40% in that segment.
Yep.
But the wholesale 40-50% across the board, which is the deflationary depression, so far the evidence for that is not here.
Yeah, and that's why I always say go granular. You know, units versus houses, different locations, because this is not a single market, a single property market. It's a whole bunch of different property markets.
That's right.
Okay, John. So we're going to come back and revisit this a few more times from a few different perspectives. But I think the people should understand that we are in a very uncertain time. There are lots of potential risks, whichever way you look at it. But we can be pretty sure in the short term that debt ticker is going to go up and up and up, and nothing's going to stop it.
Yep.
Great. Well, not great, but I'm afraid that that does look like the way it's going to be. John, I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. We'll see you next time.